Greetings, everyone. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. This one brought to you by Wondrium. Wondrium is a series of college-level audio and video courses and documentaries produced and distributed by the Teaching Company. Of course, I'm always talking about the great courses. Those are my favorites. The big, long ones, half an hour each lecture, 20, 30, 40 lectures. I just get totally into it. But they also have short courses, tutorials, how-to lessons, travel logs, documentaries. You can take courses on cooking and photography and playing chess and stuff like that. I mostly listen to history, philosophy, economics, and of course all the science stuff. Here's one that's of great interest. I started this one. I got through lecture 10 out of 36 lectures. This one's on myth in human history. Discover the truths hidden within the world's most enduring myths in the entertaining and illuminating Myth in Human History course, delivered by the engaging storyteller and award-winning professor Grant Voth. Okay, I didn't DNF on this. I just found another course I was interested in and switched around. That's the beauty of streaming these courses. When I started with this company back in the long ago, they were shipping me boxes of cassette tapes that I listened to on my Sony Walkman. Yeah, that's how old I am. Anyway, I'm going to come back to this one. 36 30-minute lectures. Here's some of the ones I'm going to listen to that I haven't heard. The Eclipse of the Goddess, Isis and Osiris, Shamans and Vegetation Gods. Vegetation Gods? What? Creator Gods, Gods and Goddesses of India, Hero Myths. Joseph Campbell. Gilgamesh. Oh, gotta listen to that one. Oh, my favorite, Jason and the Argonauts. 30 minutes on Jason and the Argonauts. I saw the movie, but I don't know the real story. All right. So that's the deal. Subscribe to wondrium.com/Shermer through that URL. And you get 2 years for the price of one. And then you can access not just this course, but hundreds and hundreds of courses like this. If you do it through the show, go to Wondrium, WONDRIUM.com/Shermer, SHERMER, WONDRIUM.com/Shermer. Check it out. 2 years for the price of one. Don't listen to my show until you've gone over there, subscribe, then come back. Okay? Do it. It's worth it. All right. Thanks for listening. Here you go. Just to remind you, my day job is publishing Skeptic Magazine, the quarterly publication of the Skeptic Society. We're a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization. You can order the magazine at skeptic.com/magazine, or you can go to your local Barnes & Noble or independent bookstore. Most of them carry it there. It's usually in the science section, sometimes in the New Age spirituality section, which is weird, but okay. And the Society is the primary sponsor of this podcast. So if you want to give us support there, go to skeptic.com/donate. And your donations are tax deductible. Okay, my guest today is Dr. Jean Twenge. She is professor of psychology at San Diego State University and the author of more than 100 scientific publications and several books based on her research, including Generations iGen and Generation Me. Generations is the new book. Here it is. The real differences between Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, and Silence, and what they mean for America's future. You've probably seen her or read her in Time Magazine, The Atlantic, Newsweek, The New York Times, USA, The Washington Post, Today, Good Morning America, Fox and Friends, CBS This Morning, and on NPR, of course. She lives in San Diego with her husband and 3 daughters who are Gen Zs, if I recall correctly. Is that right?
That's right.
And you must be a Gen Xer, yes?
I am.
Okay, well, I'm a boomer, so we'll see how different we are. All right, before we dive into the book, I love the book, by the way. I listened to it in audio, but I have to say, I'm going to recommend to listeners to get the physical book because of all the graphs. There must be, 100 of these kind of tables and graphs and charts. It's very data-driven. This is not a impression of generations or anecdotes of generational differences. It's actual hard data. So, but before we get into all that, just what's your story? How'd you get into it? What is your generation? How do you account for your particular life course based on your generation if you were going to apply that? And what other factors of education or mentors or parenting or peer groups or whatever?
Yeah. Well, my interest in generations started when I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago working on my senior honors thesis. And I was using this questionnaire that measures personality traits that are often stereotyped as being masculine or feminine. So things like assertiveness and leadership are on the M scale. And I gave it to a bunch of my classmates that was interested in gender roles. And their scores are really different from what the 1970s test manual said they should be. And that got me thinking that might be a generational difference. But it's one sample. So I went to grad school the next year at University of Michigan for personality psychology and gave out that same questionnaire to the undergrads there, found the same thing, and realized, let's try to find everybody who has used this questionnaire for college samples, trace it over time, and saw a really, really linear trend in especially women scoring higher on those traits like assertiveness and leadership. Realized, this makes perfect sense. This is a generational difference. This is what has changed in women's lives over this 20-year period. So that's what got me started.
Yeah, interesting. In other words, it's not just within the individual's own thought processes or individual life courses that they were influenced by this or that thing of their parents or peer groups or mentors or whatever. There's some larger force at work that's long enough and slow enough, it's hard to see without data. So I guess the first question I was going to ask you is, my first question is, where'd you get all the data? But here it is on page 20, 21, and 22, 3 pages of just your sources of data. And I had no idea there's this much data. What is it? A total of 39,198,000 survey subjects, including the U.S. Census Bureau, the Democracy Fund, the Pew Charitable Trust, Harvard and YouGov, Gallup, CDC, University of Michigan, UCLA, Stanford, Bureau of Labor Statistics, World Values Survey, University College London, World Health Organization, and it just goes on and on. It's astonishing. I had no idea all that data was out there.
Yeah.
How did you find all that?
About 3 years ago, when I started working on this book, I didn't even know there was that much out there either.
Oh, wow.
It was, because I had been working with a lot of big surveys of teens and young adults. So those I've worked with for, a decade or two now. But I've been writing this book on all the generations. I branched out into all the surveys of adults and just, came across a few of the big ones early on, but then kept finding more. I mean, it's a treasure trove. It's great living in the age of big data.
Mm-hmm. Why does the government care about this? Marriage rates or divorce rates or how much money people make across generations?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. A lot of these surveys, certainly not all of them, but a lot of them are government funded. A lot of this data is collected by the Census Bureau, by the CDC, because there's national interest in knowing about mental health and physical health and all of those other things that the Census Bureau looks at, like marriage rates and so on.
Yeah, I can see that because it could make a difference for national health or whatever, the economy, politics, and so on. So it's good to know. How do you define a generation? Let's think of it this way. I mean, there's not like there's the Olympic opening ceremony on Tuesday afternoon at 2:00 and the Gen Xers are born, right? So it's kind of a fuzzy set. So how do you all who study this decide that's the year? Did the Millennials start in 1981 or whatever?
Yeah. I mean, pretty much everybody agrees that culture's changed, that living now is different from what it was like to live 50 years ago or 20 years ago. And that obviously has an impact on people. So really what's debated is just, where to put the cutoffs, what to call the generations. The basic premise is not really debated, that people are affected by the time that they were born. So the word generations, really originated with family generations. So if you have 3 generations in the same household of grandma and grandpa, and then the parents and the kids. But the way we use it now is much more about social generations, and that's a group of people born in some usually 15 to 20 year period, and we just have to decide where the cutoffs are. So for baby boomers, there's the logical cutoffs based on the birth rate. That's how the generation got its name. A lot of the others are a little bit more debatable. So exactly where baby boomers end and Gen Xers begin. The cutoff between Gen Xers and Millennials, I think, is especially debatable. The one between millennials and Gen Z, though, I based on the data in these big surveys. So, because for big samples of teens, right around 2012 is when you really start to see a big difference in terms of rates of loneliness and depression going up. And it was a really sudden change. So I'm a little more confident of that cutoff of around 1995 for the beginning of Gen Z.
Right. So your thesis is that it's primarily technology driving these generational differences. So there it's easy to say, well, look, the iPhone was invented at this point, and the internet came online here, or air conditioning, or the birth control pill, or whatever.
Yeah. And, the traditional theory of generations focuses on events. How old were you when World War II happened, or 9/11 happened, or the COVID-19 pandemic happened? But, that just doesn't have that much impact on day-to-day life long term. Short term, it does. But in terms of really shaping worldviews, behaviors, personality traits, technology has a much bigger impact there, because it's not just technology, it's its downstream effects. Things like individualism, more focus on the self and less on others. The slow life strategy, where the whole life trajectory is slowed down because we live longer now. So kids are less independent, young adults marry later, teens are less likely to get their driver's license or have a paid job. Middle-aged people look and feel younger than their parents did at the same age, so 60 is the new 50, all these types of ideas. These are all the downstream effects on technology. And that's why it's so different to be, say, a Gen Z person versus someone who was born in 1925 to 45 in the silent generation.
Yeah, so I was born in 54, so an Eisenhower baby, which I know nothing about. I vaguely remember Kennedy being assassinated, but it had no effect on my life. Or Watergate, or the assassination of Martin Luther King. But television, just day to day. So that's what you mean, like, or that we got air conditioning, or that my mom had appliances, or, when I could buy a home or invest, and so on. These are the long-term, really more influential things.
Exactly. And there's so many examples of this. So, Gen Z is a great example that the way they spend their time outside of school is fundamentally different than it was for teens even just 15 years ago. They spend a lot more time online, a lot less time with their friends face to face. And then going back further in time, labor-saving devices were something I got a little obsessed with while writing this book, particularly washing machines, because I often thought about what it would have been like if I had been born in 1871 instead of 1971. Especially as a woman, how would I have spent my days? Probably exclusively on housework, because you had to for survival. Laundry is a really great example of that. Put the water on an open fire and then put the clothes in there, and it would take all day. And now you put your stuff in a washing machine and then you go relax. It's very different.
Right. So, and that also frees you up to be a college professor and write books, whereas you probably would not have been able to do that a century before. Right. So much of how lives turn out is just the luck of when you happen to have been born, or where you happen to have been born.
Yeah, it's true. And that's really why we have generational differences, because when you're born has a big impact on how you end up living your life.
Okay, so let's look at how social scientists think about these things, like how to untangle that rat's nest of interacting causal variables that social scientists study: age, gender, race, religion, politics, socioeconomic status, big events, slow trends, time period effects, generational effects. How do you know that somebody who's a Gen Xer does X or Y or whatever, and it's because of one or the other, or six of them interacting, or, how do you tease those apart?
Yeah. So, people vary on many aspects other than generation, of course. This is something that's not unique to looking at generational differences. So it's the same if you look at sex differences or differences by region. Of course, people are going to vary in many other ways. There's going to be very much variation within the group, not just between groups. But again, not unique to studying generations. Then there's the question, as you mentioned, of age period and cohort. that one is much harder to address because each is the product of the other two. So getting rid of age is slightly easier because fortunately most of these big data sets that I work with go back decades. There's some that go back to the 1940s, a lot of them go back to the 70s or the 1990s, and then we can look at each generation at the same age. So that means we can be a lot more confident that what we're seeing isn't just being one age or developmental stage, it's actually different. That being 20 is different now than it used to be. Being 40 is different now in one way or another. What's harder is to eliminate what's called a time period effect. So something that's changed over time that has had the same impact across all generations. Most of the time, there's some combination of a generational and time period effect in this data. Same-sex marriage is a great example. So support for same-sex marriage, there's certainly still a generation gap in that younger generations tend to be more supportive, but older generations change their view on that too. It wasn't that it was just the younger generation coming in that changed the overall, average support of same-sex marriage in the U.S. It was people changing their viewpoint too. So there was both a time period effect and a generational one.
So the women's support for women's rights, say in the 70s, or civil rights in the 50s and 60s, shows a different effect of generation support.
I mean, that's another example where you see that older people tended to change some of their attitudes as well, and then the younger generations coming up also changed the picture.
Interesting. So you would make a comparison like a 25-year-old in 1945 versus a 25-year-old in 1955. 25-year-old, 1965, and so on. What are they married? How much money do they make? How religious are they? Whatever. And those differences, then you would say, are due to these generational effects.
Either generation or time period.
Time period, yeah.
Yeah, and it's sometimes hard to separate those two.
What about wearing bell bottoms? You didn't have to suffer through that.
Oh well.
So that's culture, right?
So here's the thing, with fashion trends are one of those interesting examples. So bell bottoms in the 70s, but guess what? They came back in 1994.
Oh God, I missed that. That's too bad.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what was funny. So my brother and I laughed at my dad because he had kept some of his bell bottoms, and he's like, "I'm going to still wear these. These are in style." And we were like literally rolling on the floor laughing as children. And my dad said, I'm going to keep these because they're going to come back in style. And we thought that was hilarious. And he was right. And I always said, that says something that my dad was right about a fashion trend coming back means I'm not doing this.
That's really funny. Well, but that leads me to touch on cyclical theories of history, which I've always been skeptical of, like Marxist theories, this is going to happen and that's going to happen. As if there's some kind of teleological force out there pulling us toward it or repeating things, like there's kind of this mystical quantum field out there that's causing things to happen. So you pretty much debunked that, I think, in the book, right? Because there was somebody who wrote a book on the cyclical generations, and that's a testable hypothesis.
Yeah. So Strauss and Howe, 1991, their book was also called Generations. So, it is an amazing book. They trace things all the way back to like the 1500s, to make their case about the cycles of generations. They think it falls apart in a couple of ways. First, I think maybe there might be some truth to it up until about baby boomers, and then it really falls apart. If you look at what they say, these cycles of 4 different types of generations, it only sort of fits Gen X. It really doesn't fit Millennials, and it doesn't fit Gen Z either in terms of the reflection. So, I mean, it's just one example. They say Gen Z is going to be very much like the Silents. Well, the Silent generation married at younger ages than any generation in American history, and Gen Z is doing exactly the opposite. The Silent generation, pretty rigid gender roles. Again, Gen Z, not only do they not have rigid gender roles, but they say there's more than 2 genders, and they're very supportive of people being non-binary or trans.
So on life history, short, rapid, short versus long and
slow and fast.
Slow and fast, yeah. So what's the mechanism there? If I know I'm going to live longer and my children are likely to survive, I don't need to marry early, have 20 children or whatever, because half of them will die or anything like that. I mean, but no one actually thinks about that. I mean, I don't consciously make a rational decision like that. How does it affect people's behavior?
I think it ends up being a cultural influence. That I think you're right. It's not even really what individuals do. It's that the norm changes in the culture as life expectancy rises and healthcare gets better and infant mortality goes down. That it just becomes the cultural norm to have children at 30 instead of 20, to have 2 children instead of 4. And that, those types of cultural influences can be very strong. I mean, some of my training is in social psychology, and that's what social psychology tells us, is there can be a really strong influence of norms. And I think, when people get married and when they have children and how many children they have, very, very strong cultural norms when it comes to that. My own personal example of this is because I have 3 children, and when I was pregnant with my 3rd, people would actually come up and ask me, "Hey, was that a mistake?" Which really cracked me up, because because there is such a strong cultural norm to have 2 children,
right?
No, it wasn't. So that's why I thought it was funny, but it really does show how strong that norm is.
It reminds me of that line from Matilda. It was Danny DeVito played the character where the one says, "Oh, that the third child was a mistake," and he says, "They're all mistakes."
God. Terrible.
There's that cynical view of that. So in other words, I'm in college and I graduate from college to get a job, and all my friends are staying single. They're not having kids yet. And I just look around and kind of absorb that, like, oh yeah, so I don't really have to kind of rush things. So that's what you mean by a norm, or what I see on TV or books that I read, newspaper stories, things like that.
Exactly. And that's something I talk about in the book too, where we have to realize that we are influenced by these things. That, I use the example of, say, a young Gen Z guy who's in college, and he's like, you know what, I want to get married right after I graduate. So he's got to find a young woman who also wants to do that, who he's going to be compatible with. And then they're going to be the only ones in their peer group who are married. And then if they have kids soon after, they're again going to be the only ones in their peer group who, have children. It would be a very different experience than a silent generation young man who did that, because then all of their friends would be doing that at the same time.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So no one's making rational calculations. They're just doing what other people are doing, sort of following those trends. Much like, I think, moral progress, that I a section in my book, The Moral Arc, on how, like, television scripts and TV shows and films, books, novels, things like this, that people just shift the use of language and we all sort of incorporate it without even thinking about it. And then all of a sudden you're just more tolerant or more open to experience or more liberal in terms of civil rights and things like that, without anybody from the top down saying this is what you got to do, or even making a rational argument, although rational arguments help.
Yeah, I think so. And, that's one of the other things about cultural change that I love exploring, is that influence of pop culture and how that reflects, what really happens. So one of my favorite data sources is Google Books. So the Google Books database, they've scanned in the full text of millions of books. So you can look, say, just at American books, and you can trace the use of words in books all the way back to the 1800s. And you can really show that cultural change, where it's not even about individuals and their personalities and their behaviors. It's books, cultural product. It reflects, what's going on in the culture at large, at least in theory. And just, some fascinating changes in there, that the increased use of words like unique and identity really capture the rise of individualism, for example.
Right. So certain adjectives, pronouns, whatever, start to get proliferating through the culture, and we all just adopt it. Yeah. I did an analysis like that for terrorism, existential threat. Right. Of course, there's a massive spike after 9/11. Now I suspect there's going to be one over Chat GPT and AI, existential threat.
Right.
Which I'm skeptical of, but yeah. Right. So I had my first child at 37, and I thought, oh boy, this must be really old. But then at school functions, like, oh, there's a lot of dads my age. So, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So what am I doing there? Looking for social proof, like it's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's kind of classic human nature. We look around us at how other people are behaving and what they're doing, and is this normal or is this not?
Right. I had to do it again because my daughter's now 31, but I have a 7-year-old son. So really because I'm 68, right? So 61. And I was I wasn't worried about it, but I was just like, gosh, am I the only one? And so I started looking around. Are there other guys? And yes, there are. I've actually found some older with a bigger gap. And I thought, okay.
Yep.
Right. Mm-hmm. So again, I think that makes a difference. Okay, let's look at, so first of all, I wanted to ask you why you started with, you really start with silence, then baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and then the current polars. But why start with the silent? Why not what's the greatest generation? They're born,
yeah.
So they fought World War II, so they would have been born around 1900.
Right. So 1900 to 1924, roughly.
Yeah.
There's very few of the greatest generation left.
Right.
The youngest are almost 100. So the idea in the book was to look at the 6 living American generations, those at least with the quorum of living members. So that's why I started with the silence.
Okay. But how far back could you go? But based on your thesis of technology change as a driver, what about the Industrial Revolution or the printing press, if you want to go that far back? Does that change things?
Yeah. I mean, you could. So in theory, if you want to think about the impact of technology, I think you can definitely take the argument back quite a ways to say that technology's had a big impact. But you could definitely argue that technological change has accelerated in recent decades and led to even greater generational differences. And I think that's true. I think the generation gaps that we're living with right now are just as pronounced as those that the first wave of boomers were experiencing in the late 1960s between them and their greatest generation parents. There's a lot of misunderstandings there. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings now.
Okay, acceleration of the change due to technology. Yeah. So most of us are fond of saying that the gay rights, same-sex marriage rights, was the fastest revolution in history, faster than women's rights, which itself was faster than civil rights. It took a long time. Is that a real effect, or is that it just happened to be that way because of particular incidents in history? 2011, Hillary and Obama were both against same-sex marriage, but 4 years later, it's the law of the land. That's astonishing.
Yeah, it really is, and it's hard to say exactly why that change was faster, but I think some of what you were mentioning about media may have had something to do with it.
I think so, but that would be your thesis then for the spike in depression and anxiety and so on in Gen Z, because the internet puts all this out there so fast.
Yeah, so the thesis there is, you see the spike in depression starting around 2012 among teens. But that's not just because of the technology, so it is. I mean, at the end of 2012 was the first time the majority of Americans owned a smartphone. It's also when social media use moved from optional to mandatory. But they also started spending less time with their friends face to face and less time sleeping. So that's not a good formula for mental health.
Right, but the whole idea behind Facebook was, you can have instant friends anytime, and this should be a great social glue, right? I mean, Father McKenzie and Eleanor Rigby could be Facebook friends, and all the lonely people will disappear. But how come that didn't happen?
Well, I think that idea goes on the assumption that interacting on social media is just as good as interacting face to face in the same room with someone in real time, and it's not. And I think that's very intuitive, and we also know that from, say, looking at how it correlates with depression and happiness. And it just doesn't work the same way.
Is that data, this big spike, 300-something% for girls and 150% for boys in self-reported depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, cutting, things like that, anorexia? There's no question about that, right? That's not just some random blip in the data.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely clear at this point from source after source that there's an increase in anxiety, in depression. And it's not just symptoms, it's also behaviors that can be objectively measured. Like emergency room admissions for self-harm have quadrupled among 10 to 14-year-old girls, for example. Emergency room admissions for suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts, completed suicides. All of these have increased, and the pattern is very, very similar across the board from all of these different sources.
Now, how do you know that us baby boomers and you Gen Xers didn't feel the same way, but there was no social support system to turn to? There were no counselors at college that you could go to. Like at Chapman, where I teach, we have psychiatrists on board, clinical psychologists on board. I get letters every semester now that I never used to get. Please excuse so-and-so from having to speak in front of the class or give more time for. And that just system was never there before. So maybe the underlying problem was always there, but there's no support system for it.
Well, I don't think so, because those data sets where they're looking at symptoms and clinical level depression and loneliness and so on, those are cross sections of the population. They're not people who are seeking help necessarily. So the measure of clinical level depression, the National Study of Drug Use and Health, it's designed to be a cross section of the population, whether they get help or not.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's probably right. So I don't know if I'm helpful or not, but I mean, I'm pretty sympathetic to my students, but I just want to say as a boomer, well, so what? No one likes public speaking. Good. Get up there and do it, and you'll be a stronger person for it. And I had just one woman who's just like, I just can't do it. And I said, well, what will happen if you walk up there? I'll give you all the support. I'll stand there next to you, or I'll run your PowerPoint for you, or whatever. She said, I won't be able to speak. I'll cry and sweat and break down and just have an anxiety attack. I'm like, okay, I don't want to put anybody through that, right? So, but my generation just would not have done that, I think.
So, I mean, there's a balance to be struck here. When you think about some of the generational change in these attitudes, it is amazing and wonderful that Gen Z places so much emphasis on mental health and wants to help people and wants to try to prevent breakdowns and something. Their heart's in the right place. I think the difficulty is sometimes the way that that's done is actually counter to how therapy is done. So public speaking and fear around public speaking is a really good example. It's a form of a phobia. And the best treatment for phobia is exposure therapy. It works incredibly well, incredibly quickly. Compared to, say, treating depression, it's amazing how fast it can happen, no matter what the phobia is. So when I teach intro psych, for example, I show this video that it blew me away the first time I saw it. It's a woman who's deathly afraid of snakes, kind of the reaction that you're describing, crying, cowering, they show this, they film it, but she wants to get over it, so she agrees to exposure therapy. And by the end of it, not only is she in the same room as the snake without panicking, and this is 3 hours later, she's holding the snake.
Oh my God. Because
exposure therapy tells you did this and you didn't die. And then your fear goes away.
So that's part of cognitive behavior therapy.
It has some similarities and overlap, yeah, but it's specifically for phobias.
I see. Right. Yeah. I always tell the students that little bit from Jerry Seinfeld where he talks about fear of public speaking, and that most people, if they are at a funeral, they'd rather be the corpse than the person giving the eulogy. And they laugh and they're like, see, it's not that bad. But yeah, so I've kind of followed some of this debate. I know you're involved with it along with Jonathan Haidt and others about, targeting the specific problem, social media, Facebook, specifically screen time in general. Is it this weaker coddling of the American mind, as Jonathan calls it? And it goes back to us boomers and you Gen Xers as parents. We were helicopter parents hovering over our children because of the spike in crime in the 60s and 70s. So we're all worried about this. And that shifted from that, sort of free range children to, arrange play dates and coddling of children. I do that. I know I do that. I know I shouldn't, but I
And I don't think that's due to the crime rate. I think that's due to the slow life strategy of having fewer children and nurturing them more carefully.
Oh, okay. All right. Interesting. And so, but with the current problem, what do you recommend for screen time for specific social media sites or what?
So 2 pieces of advice. So one is no phones in the bedroom overnight. And that's not just for kids and teens, it's for everybody. Tons of research on this that people do not sleep as well or as deeply when their phone is within arm's reach. But pretty much everybody I talk to has their phone on their bedside table. And when we talk about this, they'll say, but wait, I have to have my phone in my bedroom overnight because it's my alarm clock. Then I say, I have some advice for you. Buy an alarm clock. You can buy it on your phone on Amazon and then put your phone away in another room and get a good night's sleep. So that's the first one. And then the second one, if you have kids, put off the smartphone for as long as possible and put off social media for as long as possible. There are safer ways for kids to communicate. So, especially for older teens, they want to stay in touch with their friends. Well, they don't have to use social media to do that. They can do group text or some other method. So I have 3 kids. They're 16, 13, and 11. So my 16-year-old just got her first smartphone a month ago. She had a flip phone up to that point.
Really?
She said it became part of her identity. We had a lot of.
They still make flip phones?
They absolutely still make flip phones. I've actually seen in the last couple of months a couple articles saying that they're kind of making a comeback because people realize that then they can have that for safety and convenience. But then if they're going out at night, then there's not the distraction of having the smartphone and having the notifications come in and so on. And then there's other products that are specifically made for kids. So like my 13-year-old has a Gab phone, and that is, it's based on the Android phone, but you can call, text, and take pictures. That's it. So there's no ability to do games or social media on it. You can't download apps.
Interesting. Okay. So there's a market for that.
Yes.
Have you noticed this? I've been teaching since the early 80s. Used to, as a professor, walk into the classroom, you have this kind of buzz, excitement, energy of all the students talking to each other. Now I walk in and no one's talking to anyone. They're just on their phones.
Yeah. And I think that's a problem at the university level. It's an even bigger problem at high schools because a lot of high schools, kids are allowed to have their phones during the day. So then they're a distraction in the classroom. And then you go into a high school lunchroom and it's eerily quiet because they're all on their phones instead of talking to each other. So, and that's distressing too, because, what do jobs need right now? Managers tell me this, makes sense. AI's coming in. We need real humans with social skills. And how are they going to develop those social skills? Well, talking to each other at lunch and going out and hanging out with friends. That's how they do that. And that's just not happening as much.
I have a professor friend at Pepperdine University where I did a guest talk for him. And he collected all the phones at the door. And he put them in his bag, and so and the dynamic was completely different. It's like students were totally engaged. Thought, man, and I sort of feel like I should do that, but then I sort of feel like, well, aren't I kind of saying I'm not a very good professor if I can't teach good enough to keep these kids off their cell phones?
Yeah, so this is the debate back and forth, and I have seen that argument made of, just be more engaging. I think that's really, really unfair because especially when we're talking about, say, 18 to 23-year-olds, do we really think we're going to be able to compete with what's on their phones?
No.
I mean, let's just take social media as just one example. They poured millions, if not billions of dollars into algorithms that keep people looking at it and keep them coming back. How can we compete with that?
Yeah, impossible. I know. I try to be an animated speaker, but it's just not the same. And it's better when I ask them, just close your laptops, put your phones down. This is not going to be on the test. I just want to talk for a minute and have a conversation. And it's much better.
Yeah, but, then if it's not going to be on the test, why should they listen?
Yes, I know. I had to give them a little pep talk at the beginning of the semester because somebody asked about GPT for the test because these are take-home tests. And I said, well, I'll know if you wrote this or not because I know the books and the lectures intimately. But I'm not sure. I'm told by my AA friends, you're not going to be able to tell at some point.
Yeah.
And so then I had to say, well, what's the point of being in college if you're just going to hire a company to write your tests for you. I mean, just go out and get a job and make money. I mean, what's the, of course, that sounds idiotic because, of course, I want the degree because I'll make more money and it's fun to be in college. I just don't want to do the work. It's like, all right.
Classic.
Classic what? Boomer?
Well, I mean, we could talk about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation to go to college. And yeah, intrinsic motivation has gone down and extrinsic has gone up. So in other words, wanting to go to college for the joy of learning, a little less popular than it used to be, and going to college to get a good job has become more popular. Now, to be fair, that started with Gen X, but it has kept going.
Really? So it's more pragmatic. And what do you attribute the increase in college tuition and the return on investment, as it were, if that's the calculation?
Yeah, well, I mean, getting a college degree is more required for more jobs now, and it is still true that those who get a college degree do make more money. But if you're asking me, why has tuition gone up so much? I think that's a little out of my wheelhouse. But many people have argued it's not just because of better education in the classroom, that there's other factors.
Yeah, I just had dinner with the president of Chapman University. He's a friend of mine. And so I've asked him this question. He says, well, in part, you should see the money we have to spend on the dorms, the gyms, the climbing wall, the swimming. You should see the swimming pool we're building. I mean, it's got like fountains. And he said, you and I would this would be like a resort vacation trip we would take. So some of that, I think. Maybe the students are expecting it's not just a place to go to get an education. It's a home away from home. It's like going to a Club Med kind of thing. And would that be a generational expectation difference?
It could be. It's. I think there's a bunch of factors in there too, though.
Yeah, probably so. Okay, so let's think about the comparative method, comparing generations in different countries. Have you seen these effects, say, in Western European countries, for example?
So there's trends in mental health that I described with teen loneliness and depression, self-harm going up after 2012. Yes, there's a lot of really solid international data, particularly for English-speaking countries, but we're seeing more in Scandinavian and Nordic countries too. And for adolescent loneliness, are able to look at this in 37 countries around the world in the PISA survey, and they showed pretty much exactly the same pattern as the US data, that teen loneliness started to increase around 2012 and then kept going.
And the same gender difference, girls have more of these issues than boys, but all of them?
Generally, yeah. Yeah, the increases in loneliness and depression, for the most part, tend to be larger among girls than among boys.
And why? Why more girls than boys?
Well, girls spend more time on social media. So if social media is one of the primary drivers, that makes sense. Social media is also a much more fraught place for girls and young women, with the body image issues and cyberbullying and just the emphasis on appearance overall. You think about it, Instagram at base is a platform where teen girls and young women take pictures of themselves and then ask people to comment on them.
Oh, right. So there it is. Directly comparison. One of my student TED Talks Monday was on what's it called? The pretty privilege. So she went on and on about this, and I had no idea. There was like some art of putting on makeup so it looks like you don't have any makeup on. Apparently this is quite a learned skill.
Yes. There's, many people have written about the pressures that young women feel, around appearance, and it can be really considerable. I mean, some of the research on this was done by Meta themselves, Facebook, who owns Instagram. That's some of the leaked documents of their research. That's what it found, was many, many, many teen girls saying that their body image issues were due to Instagram.
Yeah, so maybe this is just my okay boomer speaking here, but what's the problem? Just get off social media. Just do it an hour a day rather than 6 hours a day, or just don't compare yourself. But maybe that's, I'm a middle-aged white guy with, what do I care about any of this stuff? And maybe I just don't know what it feels like to be a 15-year-old girl.
Yeah. Well, it's hard because, a lot of girls would like to not use social media, but that's where their friends are.
Mm.
And they want to keep in touch with their friends. And the algorithms, again, are just keeping them on for as long as possible.
Yeah, I've heard the various tech people that are concerned about this go on and on about this, the like button and all that stuff. And I've been kind of skeptical of some of this. I call this the Oppenheimer Syndrome. Like I'm like J. Robert Oppenheimer with blood on my hands because I invented the like button. These are like nuclear weapons. Oh, come on. But on the other hand, maybe that's the kind of thing a boomer would say because I just really don't get the power of all that.
And it is really powerful. That research that was leaked showed, somewhere between 5 and 15% of teens who said that they had thought about taking their own lives, that they traced that to using Instagram. That's pretty incredible.
Wow. Right. So this is FOMO, fear of missing out, FOBLO, fear of being left out, and related things, right?
That's the thing. There's so many different mechanisms. So if you're spending 7 hours a day on social media, which about 25% of 10th grade girls do.
7 hours?
Which is incredible. Yeah, I know. Isn't that incredible? Yeah. So then you're probably not sleeping enough. You're probably not seeing people face to face enough. You're probably not exercising enough. So it can displace time for other things. Probably not spending enough time on homework. There's all these displacement mechanisms. Then there's the pressure of social comparison. Then there's more potential for cyberbullying. There's sexual exploitation that happens on those sites because adults can contact minors, and just all of these problems.
Mm. Do you have an opinion on what to do about it? Regulate the tech companies, get them to regulate themselves, break them up?
Yeah, social media is very, very unregulated right now. Mm-hmm. So there's supposed to be a minimum age of 13. It's not enforced. 13 is a terrible time to introduce social media. So I think we should raise the minimum age for social media to 16 and enforce it, do actual age verification.
How would you do that?
Well, that's their problem, is my quick answer. The more complicated answer is there are companies who do that. There are third-party vendors who do that type of age verification, so many that they have their own trade association now. So it is doable.
Wow. Okay. And do you attribute that also to the political polarization that we've seen in the last decade or so? Or maybe, so I guess it starts in 2004, where you see those graphs of people that self-identify as centrist, just to the left, just to the right of center, that those have shrunk, and the polls, the means have spread apart. People self-identify as far left, far right have increased. What is your explanation for that, generationally or technology, or whatever?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the media environment, and just it's more atomized. You can get your news from more sources. When you were young, even when I was young, it was 3 channels on TV with an evening newscast, or you'd read a newspaper. And, sure, those sources might have somewhat of a political slant, but it's very different from what we have now, where it's such an atomized environment. So we had cable. First, there was cable news, then all the sources online, then social, like internet news, and then social media. And now, it's not just that people get their news from different sources. We can't even agree on basic facts.
Right. Hey, I got something to show you. All right. Here we go. I have a physical newspaper. It comes to my office every day.
Right.
I'm such a boomer. Mm-hmm. And I try to read also Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and kind of add them up and divide by 2 to get the truth. No. I guess that's gone down. I get it to a certain extent. The examples I use, the people I follow on Twitter are mostly writers and scientists, and some of them are very successful. Most of them are friends of mine. So I'm happy when I see that they won an award, or they got invited to this conference to speak, or they got a new book contract or whatever. And I think, oh, that's great. How come I didn't get invited to that conference to speak? Wait a minute. How come I didn't win that award? I've never won that award. So I kind of get that a little bit. I have to talk myself down. Come on, Shermer. It's not a big deal. And he's your friend. Be happy for him. Yeah, okay. But maybe if I was 20, I'd really be freaking out in comparison.
Or 12. Think about that. You're a 12-year-old girl, uncertain about her appearance and about her body, and then posts pictures and doesn't get likes. or her friend gets more likes. And what does that do to her self-esteem and, just even her sense of well-being?
Right. It was interesting you teased apart the hypothesis that Trump was a primary driver of a lot of this polarization, but you point out it started not just polarization, but the various problems we're talking about before him, way before Trump.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a couple of trends that I identified that I think help explain Trump because they were there before. So one is trends in mental health, and this is in the Boomer chapter. It used to be that mental health, like happiness or depression, was only weakly linked to income and education. And then what started to happen is that diverged. So in particular, what really accelerated was the dissatisfaction and depression of those without a college degree and of lower income. It started to really, really rise and diverge from those who have a college education and doing better in terms of income. And that really, I think, starts to explain Trump in 2016, that dissatisfaction among the working class.
Feeling like they were not being serviced by the Democratic Party, who traditionally did cater to them. Is that what you mean?
I think that's part of it, but I think it goes beyond politics. Just that population started to see, a lot more issues. Where, kind of the famous example of this is the economists who talk about the deaths of despair among this group. And a lot of the opioid epidemic, that's the group that's gotten hit the hardest.
And this is post 2007, 2008 Great Recession. They never recovered like everyone on Wall Street recovered and still got their bonuses.
Well, median income certainly recovered overall, but there's other issues. It's not just income. It's not just economic struggles. It is a lot of these issues around drug and alcohol abuse, around loneliness and disconnection from other people is an enormous problem. It's an enormous problem across the board, but you see it, I think, in particular in those groups where they're, just not integrated into society as much.
Let's think about politics over the long run here. What are some of the generational differences going back, say, to pre-World War II all the way up to the present? We live in a duopoly, so pretty much half the country votes Democrat, half votes Republican, more or less. But how do those emphases shift generationally, and why?
Well, yeah, there was a really interesting paper on this a few years ago. Crunched a bunch of numbers and said, well, if you want to predict a generation's political leanings, look at who was president when they were adolescents and young adults, and then how popular that president was.
Right.
So, for example, Gen X is more conservative and Republican, and were even going back to when they were young adults, possibly because they were young when Reagan was president, a popular Republican president. Millennials lean more liberal and Democrat. They were young when Obama was president. Who knows about Gen Z? Because neither Trump nor Biden has been particularly popular, so we'll have to see which way they lean.
And they're too young for Obama's last term to have had an effect by that.
Pretty much, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Andrew Yang posted a funny tweet the other day about our political system. It would be like the NBA, because the NBA final playoffs just started. It'd be like if the NBA still featured Larry Bird and Magic Johnson from the 1980s. That's pretty much what we have in politics. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, okay. So let's think about the effects of, socioeconomic class and how average income has shifted over generations. To what extent is that having to do with values of work and commitment, how much money people want to make, versus just long-term economic trends that do happen, cycles in economics or whatever?
Yeah, this is one of the first things that I looked at, because there's a really strong narrative that millennials are broke, that they'll be the first generation to not do as well as their parents, And, that had some validity when they were, young college graduates during the Great Recession. Even in the years afterward, there was some catch-up time. But then things changed, and they changed radically. So median incomes among 25 to 44-year-olds are at all-time highs, and that is corrected for inflation. So the excerpt of Generations that was printed in The Atlantic had this data, and instantly online people were like, oh yeah, well, that's because things cost more. No, this is corrected for inflation. That corrects for the cost of housing. It corrects for the cost of education and healthcare. It's that, yes, those things have gone up more, but there's other things that are less expensive than they used to be, like TVs and other consumer electronics and cars. They are, at least the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates this, that already corrects that. It already corrects for cost of living. And yes, you see the ups and downs, the cycles with economics, but overall, those numbers have gone up. So it's interesting to look at why. It's primarily because more millennials went to college, and it's also because millennial women have done so well. Their incomes are much higher than women in the boomer generation or the silent generation. So that does create a dilemma, because then if you have a heterosexual couple and they want to have children, they want to keep up both of their income streams, then you have to pay for childcare. And it is true that that it can be an added expense and an added strain on the family budget. So it's not all rosy, but this narrative of millennials not doing as well as their parents appears to be untrue by those statistics, which, again, I want to point out, that's from the U.S. Census Bureau. On Twitter, there were a lot of people who seemed to think I made it up, but no. If you have a quibble with it, please talk to the U.S. Census Bureau or the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
I wonder if it's something like that hedonic treadmill economists talk about, where it doesn't really matter how much money you make. It's just, what do your neighbors make? How big is your neighbor's house? So maybe your house is twice the square footage as your parents' house, but the neighbors have, 500 more square feet than you, and that doesn't feel good. So you then subjectively feel like you're falling behind.
And the Kardashians have even more than that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other element is, just through media, that we can see, not just the top 1%, but the top 0.1%, because that's who you see the most often on media.
That's right. You talked about the lifestyles of the rich and famous. Remember that show?
Right.
And now
it's so bad, but we loved it anyway.
Oh, it was big fun. Yeah. Well, in a way, I guess you think, well, I could have that. But, the average, back to politics and Trump, the average, say, middle class or working class Republican, why are they voting for Trump? Well, they can't believe they're going to have a penthouse in New York at some point, or whatever it is they think that they like. And his tax cuts, well, most Republicans, the tax cuts mostly help rich people, not working class people. And so on. So this is like that book, What Happened to Kansas, right? So
yeah, I was just going to say that. Yeah,
maybe they're voting based on some other values, flag and family and patriotism and that sort of thing. And it's not the economy, stupid, as Clinton famously said.
Yeah, and I this does show up. That's the interesting thing, is it used to be education was not a big predictor of political party, and now it is. And that's even the last 10 to 15 years where that's diverged a lot more. I heard someone say Republicans used to be the country club party, and now they're just the country party. So there's also an urban-rural divide.
Right, because urban goes left and rural goes right. Industrial billionaires go right. Tech billionaires go left. I have that chart showing employee donations in the 2022 midterms. It just came out, and it was just massive, like Netflix and Facebook and Apple. It's just like 99% of the money went to Democratic candidates. Astonishing.
Yeah, but some of the regulations around tech, those efforts have actually been bipartisan. It's one of the few things that have been bipartisan, is more regulation of tech.
Okay, let's talk about, more cultural trends like music, fashion, societal trends like freedom and autonomy versus safety and security that people want or don't want or need or don't need. and how that affects politics and how they differ generationally.
Yeah. So, one thing we haven't spent quite as much time on is individualism.
Yeah.
So, rising individualism, more focused on the self and less on others. So, that's a cultural system that values equality, but can also lead to disconnection if there's too much self-focus and not enough emphasis on relationships with others. So, that's grown, I think, over all of these generations that I describe in the book, starting with boomers. And then with Gen X, then you start to get the rise in positive self-views. It's like self-confidence that continues with millennials. It turns a little bit with Gen Z because they don't have the self-confidence piece quite as much, but they also are very individualistic in their viewpoints around equality. They've continued to build on that. So that's an influence that I think is rooted in technology. Technology makes individualism possible. It makes being able to live alone and have the time to focus on yourself possible. But it really has a huge impact on the way people see their lives, on their worldview. It's a fundamental cultural difference. I mean, people talk about cross-cultural differences. Individualism and collectivism that's where we have the most research because it's so fundamental.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Michelle Gelfin's research on tight versus loose cultures. I think that's related, right?
It has some overlap with, it's not exactly the same thing as individualism. They try to make a case for it being different, but when you think about the US, for example, it's individualistic and it is more loose, meaning that social rules are not as strictly enforced.
Right. Like I'm fond of saying my wife's from Germany. It's a very tight culture. When the government says you should do X, they just do it. In America, they're like, oh, no, in that case, I'm not going to do it.
Right. Exactly.
And that has changed generationally.
It has. I mean, you think about, the 1950s being the kind of classic example in the US of much more collectivistic, that, was pretty much mandatory. You were going to get married and have kids. And if you were a woman, you weren't going to have a job. And there were, of course, exceptions to that. But it was pretty difficult for a woman to have a professional career then because that social rule was so strong.
Right. So that happens, and I guess on some level we shift from descriptive to prescriptive. It's good that women have more choices and so forth. Just, I'm a big libertarian guy. Just let people do whatever they want. That's good. But I guess if you had a more collective mindset and you're thinking, well, what's best for the country, right? So, on simple things that we all agree on, it's all good. We drive on the right side of the road, so there's fewer accidents. We pay taxes, so we have a police and military. The government pays me to be married and own a home and have kids, right? I get tax deductions from this. So those are pretty normal things. But to what extent then should these norms be, marriage or, childbirth or whatever? Is that good? I don't know. I'm just kind of riffing here.
Yeah, well, that's the question, because it probably would be somewhat better if we had a little bit more collectivism, but it's a trade-off. Cultural systems are always a trade-off. That there's a lot of good things about individualism, but it does mean we're not as connected to each other, that relationships are not as stable.
What do you make of this recent shift from the idea of equality, meaning equal opportunities, and just then do your own thing, versus equity, where it seems to be equality of outcomes? That is, you have to have the exact same percentage as the general population in your company, or in incomes, or representatives in Congress, or whatever. And if it's not equal equity in that sense, then there's a problem of bias or prejudice.
Yeah, I think that can at times end up colliding with that individualistic belief that we should treat everyone equally. That is, pretty fundamental in a lot of liberal democracies. And, liberal little l, not meaning progressive, but, as a style of government and discussion. So, and I think that essential conflict is really evident in the last 10 years or so. This is one thing that really showed up in a lot of the survey data. Around 2015, that's when there was a really sudden change in attitudes around race in particular, and it started to diverge much more between Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, certainly. And also cancel culture, you discussed that a little bit. That seems to be a Gen Z thing, being outraged and offended by thoughts.
And millennials. Yeah.
Oh, and millennials.
I think, the generational break there is interesting. It's really seems to be between Gen X and millennials, which is particularly interesting because those are two generations that have a fair amount in common when it comes to individualism. But Gen Xers tend to pride themselves on being tough, on having open discussion. And then that shifted where there's more millennials on the other side. And we see this over and over and over. The newspaper editor who says, we're going to publish this op-ed even though we may disagree with it. That editor's often a Gen Xer or a boomer. And then in the young employees on the other side, usually millennials and Gen Z, who say, nope, we can't give that. You point any kind of airtime, and then the editor gets fired. I mean, that's just one example. There's others, corporations and government and many other places. But that's where the generational break so often happens is Gen Xers on one side, millennials on the other.
Is it because they're catastrophizing things, like everything gets reduced to Hitler and the Nazis, and you wouldn't give Hitler a voice, a platform on your show, would you?
I think there's a number of things going on, and I think a good amount of it is if you've lived a higher percentage of your life online, then you do tend to see things more in black and white and us versus them, and also place so much emphasis on words. The idea of words as violence is a relatively new idea.
Right. It's a crazy idea. Words is all we have to communicate because we have thoughts in our heads. You got to get them out somehow, either on paper or speaking. And so, it was our generation that kind of pioneered the whole free speech movement at UC Berkeley, where cancel culture is now dominant. Right. It's crazy.
Right. And then, and that's the other thing that's really shifted, and that shows up in the surveys too, that free speech used to be much more prized by those on the left. And now it tends to be more prized by those on the right, although it's a little more debatable in the last year with some of the book banning and these ideas. But still, for the most part, there's more support for their open discussion on the center right.
How do you think about the self-esteem movement and, everybody gets a trophy for participating? What effects does that have, or did that have?
Yeah, so that started in the childhood of Gen Xers and then probably peaked with millennials. The idea of, everybody gets a trophy, telling kids that they're special, telling kids, just be yourself, believe in yourself and anything is possible. You can be whatever you want to be, all of these things. And I think it does kids a real disservice because then they're going to go out in the world and they're not going to be treated as special and they're not going to get a trophy just for showing up.
Right. So this is one of the theories why that kind of misperception about how good life really is that you have a impact with the real world where you don't get a trophy every day at work, and you actually have to earn your self-esteem by doing things.
Yeah, and I think that's where that idea goes wrong, and they've shown that in studies of, boosting self-esteem versus boosting something that's better, like self-efficacy, of saying, I know you can do this, and here's how you do it. That actually does have a good impact on performance. Just building up self-esteem for no particular reason does not lead to better performance.
Right. And let's see, in the coddling of the American Mind book, they have that example of peanut allergies, which spiked when parents started preventing their kids from having any exposure to peanuts. Right? And so the analogy being, you need to get out there and get banged around and be stressed and have trauma so you learn to be tougher.
Yeah. And maybe not trauma, just experiences.
Life experiences, yeah, right.
Yeah, life experiences, having people disagree with you, losing every once in a while, and so on.
Right, playground, normal playground stuff. How has your research affected your own parenting? You have 3 kids.
Yeah. Definitely a lot more awareness of screens and particularly of social media that none of my kids have Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok, even the 16-year-old, and trying to put off smartphones for as long as we can. No phones in the bedroom, all that kind of stuff.
What about sports and social activities and outdoor stuff?
Yeah, we love all that. So family vacations, national parks, usually what we do. And it's interesting that one of the data sets that I look at on high school students, some of the biggest correlations with happiness are getting enough sleep, spending time with friends face to face, and participating in sports. So, kids are different. We're not going to be able to do that with all of our kids, but I think those are, we can try our best with the sleep part. We can try our best to give them the ability to get together with friends face to face. I'm all over the sports too. My 16-year-old does 2 sports. My younger 2 will have to see.
All right, I got 2 funny stories for you. So I was my daughter's soccer coach, and they lost badly on one game. Anyway, so I would always take them out for ice cream or something fun afterwards. Just had nothing to do with the outcome of the game, but this particular game where they lost really badly. And then years later, my daughter says, why were you rewarding us for losing? That was not appropriate. I'm like, what? Oh no. And I think it must be this, like, I don't want this undeserved praise. Right. And then I saw that in my son when he was like 4. We signed him up for a little ice skating. If you can believe there's an ice skating rink in Santa Barbara, but there is. And so they got the lessons, then they had a little performance, and then everybody got a ribbon. And then so, friends are like, oh, Vincent, you got this little ribbon. That's so cute. I did not finish first because they actually had a ranking of evaluation of your performance. And he was second or third or whatever. And he just quickly said, I didn't win. He didn't want to be praised for something he didn't. And I thought, boy, that's pretty insightful. So I think that the self-esteem, everyone gets a trophy movement was a horrible idea.
Yeah, I mean, kids aren't dumb. They figure these things out.
Right.
Even at 4.
Okay, let's talk about the birth control as a technological change of generations. There's a slew of books I've been getting here for the podcast by mostly conservative women saying this was a bad idea. Yes, it liberated women and the whole feminist thing. I bought the whole thing. You can have all the sex you want like men, but actually that's not a good idea because women they have a different sexual psychology than men. And this is, wrecked marriages and relationships and whatever. I don't know. What are your thoughts on some of that?
Well, there's trade-offs to everything. But was birth control a net good or a net bad? Really? I really, I don't know. I have a lot of skepticism that somebody could argue that we would have a better world right now if there was no birth control.
Yeah.
That does not seem plausible to me, both for the health and mental health of women and children. I think that's clearly a net good, even though, sure, there's certainly some downsides for, probably the way sexuality has changed in particular, toward more, say, uncommitted hookups and so on. Yeah, there's some differences there, but overall, boy, I'm glad we live in a world with birth control.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. But the shift then was, as you track in your book, women can enter the workplace because they can control their reproductive choices. They don't have to have children. They can delay childbirth and so on. And that's a net good for freedom, for liberty, autonomy for women.
Definitely. Then it's easier to be able to finish an education, to plan around your career, for example. Even if you are going to be a stay-at-home mom, that then these things aren't a surprise, and that it's done at the time that's right for your family economically and otherwise.
Right. All right, let's talk about religion, another one of my favorite topics. We've long tracked here at Skeptic. We've been in business for over 30 years now. You can see the increase in the nuns, right? The rise of the nuns, the no religious affiliation. Are they becoming atheists? Not so much. Atheism is still, I think, in the single digits, or maybe it's 9 or 10% now. But the nuns is what, a third of millennials and probably going to be half of Gen Z. Why are
Yeah.
people becoming so less religious or committed to religious institutions?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with individualism. That you can have more focus on the self and less on social rules. That's not very compatible with religion, which by definition says there's something larger than yourself. And most religions also say, here's some rules that you need to follow. So as individualism became more and more accepted, religion became less popular.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. I also think, isn't there an effective education, just in terms of evaluating the dogma claims themselves? I'd like to think may have some effect.
Yeah, although it wasn't that long ago when the college educated were just as likely to be religious
That's
as those
true.
who weren't.
Yeah, that's true. Right. Or how about another theory, Phil Zuckerman's theory? Well, he has half a dozen explanations, one of which is women make choices about religion for the families more than the men do. And women are more independent and working in the workplace, more educated, the whole thing.
I mean, that could be part of it, but you know, you can see this among teenagers, and the trends are pretty similar, say for teen girls and teen boys in this.
Hmm. Sometimes I also like to think we've made so much moral progress that we're inculcating into our minds these moral values that don't need a higher power to reinforce them. You shouldn't treat blacks and women and Jews a certain way just because, right? Sort of a Rawlsian or a Kantian, people should not be a means to an end. They're an end in themselves. And if you were a woman or a black or a Jew, how would you feel if the legislation was going to be passed? So in other words, a Rawlsian kind of veil of ignorance. And I think more and more of us are just inculcating those ideas. So what do you need religion for?
Yeah, the idea that you can teach those fundamental values in different ways.
But also governments. This is the other theory. How come America is so much more religious than Europe? It still is,
Mm-hmm.
even though the
Mm-hmm.
gap is closing. Well, one of it is that European governments have a tight social safety net, so they take care of people that need help. And that's what religions used to do, man the soup kitchens and take care of poor people. And now in America, we have a much looser social safety net. So religions have more to do, although that's now changing a bit.
Yeah. So, and I think though that the U.S. is headed in the direction of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the number of people who are religiously affiliated. It's going down that fast.
Yeah. Super interesting. Okay, let me see what else I wanted to ask you about. Oh, use of drugs and alcohol and, say, cigarettes and all that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the biggest differences between the silent generation and the boomers, that there's this really, really sudden rise in especially marijuana, but other drugs too, in that generational transition between silents and boomers. And that happened when boomers were young, but it is persisting as they get older. So as age groups transition from being mostly silents to mostly boomers, you see more problems around alcohol and drugs in those older populations.
Mm. Right, because say my parents' generations drank a lot of hard alcohol. And then the boomers did a lot of hard drugs in the 60s. I slightly missed that, which is good, I think. And now I read that the kids these days, they're just not having as many, except for recreational marijuana. They just don't drink as much, which is probably good. But they don't seem to be getting driver's licenses. They're having less sex, less hookups. Maybe that's good. Fewer STDs, fewer unwanted pregnancies, and so on.
And that's mostly from the slow life strategy, that teens are just taking longer to do these adult activities. And, for a long time, I kept reading things about, today's teens are more virtuous. Well, is it really more or less virtuous to have a job? No, it's that they're taking longer to do these adult activities. And just looking at it as good versus bad, you miss the big picture.
Yeah.
And that's really the big picture.
Right. So their norms have shifted in that direction without anybody making a decision on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was reading that example of pluralistic ignorance and the classic example of binge drinking on college campuses, where individually every student says, "Well, I don't want to do that," but I know everybody else wants to do it.
Right. Right. And then if you tell them, look, actually most people on your campus don't do this, that can actually have an impact. That's an effective intervention.
Right. Okay, I just want to look at some of these graphs and tables that you have in the book because they're so powerful. I'll hold them up to the screen for the audience. So here is infant mortality rate, U.S. and Massachusetts, 1850 to 2020. I mean, that is just a massive decline, which is good, of course.
It's amazing.
But what is the effect? So that's going to lead to more slow life.
Right.
Strategy.
So having fewer children, you don't have to have 6 kids thinking only 3 will survive or something like that.
Right. Right. Okay, then here you have figure 2, 8% of U.S. 25 to 29-year-olds with high school or 4-year college degree by race. So there you see those differences over the decades, with the black-white difference closing pretty tightly in high school, not quite so much, although it seems to be changing between 2015 and 2020. What are the effects of that?
Yeah, just more education, and that's rooted in technology as well. You know, more complex society, and you need more years of education. I mean, I think people forget that, say, especially for the greatest generation right before the silence, you know, a lot of them didn't even finish high school. That was very, very common. And so silence were the first to really, that was the norm to finish high school, maybe even go on to college, and that's built over time. Millennials, most college-educated generation to date. And that's just much more the norm. And that also ends up playing into this slow life strategy, because when you go to college, then you also tend to marry later and have kids later.
What is the effect, and is it real, of college education on lifetime income?
It's big, and it continued over time. So that's another thing that's really interesting in those median income statistics, that the wages and income for those without a college education, that actually has been fairly stagnant. But there's been a rise in the incomes of college-educated people, and so many more millennials have a 4-year college degree. And so that's why those median incomes of 25 to 44-year-olds are so high now.
So the ROI, return on investment, for a college education is still paying off just financially. Although, because I'm a boomer, I'd say, but that's not why you should go. You should go because you get to get educated, and you get to get in the liberal arts and music and science and the whole thing, and your life is just better, regardless of the money.
More knowledge. You know, the connections that you make, all of those things, and I mean, it will be interesting over the next few years to see those debates around return on investment. I mean, because of student loans, it is true. This, you got to think carefully about this. Yeah. But I mean, I can tell you this. The St. Louis Fed has looked at wealth building among millennials, and so here's the problem, right? So, okay, maybe you're going to make more money because you went to college, but then you have college loans to pay off. Does that balance out? And at least so far, it has balanced out. So millennial wealth is neck and neck with Gen Xers at the same age, and on track to equal boomers right now. So it has paid off, at least on a generational level.
Yeah, I wonder if that'll continue. I see my friend at Pepperdine told me their tuition this year, cost of everything, $92,000 a year. Holy
unbelievable.
Lord. And I think Harvard is around 90. It's just, we're coming up, it's going to be $500,000 for a degree at a private.
Yeah, crazy.
So you have to work a long time. But again, money's not the only thing.
A lot of students aren't paying that, is what the schools like to point out.
Yes, that's true. Right. But the student loan thing is terrible. If you make the minimum payment on a student loan, you're going to be paying it for decades. It's terrible. How much more you actually end up paying. I love that comment in your chapter on, was it millennials, saying, when boomers tell millennials, just get a job and pay your tuition. It's like $90,000 a year.
Right.
How am I going to do that?
Right.
Which reminded me, because when I was at Pepperdine, I went to community college for my first 2 years, Glendale Community College, free. And then I went to Pepperdine. I think it was $8,000 a year or something. It was just, and I did get a job. I paid for half. My parents paid for half. That's not doable anymore.
Yeah. It depends. I mean, it's a little more doable at, say, a community college or some, public in-state colleges.
In-state, yes, right.
But you're probably not going to be able to pay for the whole thing.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Okay, another graph here. I like this one. Figure 3.1, age distribution of the U.S. population 1970, 1995, and 2000 at the bottom. The shift, the sort of pyramid shape.
The pig in the python.
The pig, is that what that's called? Yeah, pig in the python.
Yeah, pig in the python of the baby boom.
That is
right?
just huge.
So you can see like that middle one, see that big bulge? That's the baby boomers. Oh. Yeah, so they, at the top, it's when they were young, and then in the middle, as they got older, and then it evens out in the bottom one, because then there's millennials, and it balances out a little bit more.
Right.
But, yeah.
So the effect of that is more people are living longer. Now us boomers are getting up there into retirement age. And I keep telling my students, you guys got to figure out Alzheimer's and senility quick, because my generation is going to hit the wall here pretty soon. Right. But the effects on big term effects like Social Security, is the government going to really be able to, support me in my old age, healthcare costs, things like that?
Well, the big challenge there is that the birth rate has gone down by so much, especially since 2007. And at first people said, oh, it's because of the recession, but it didn't come back. Not only did it not come back, it kept going down. And I think that's going to continue. So in the last chapter on the future, I look at some of the surveys of high school seniors, and you ask high school seniors, how likely is it that you're going to have kids? And that number was high and pretty unchanged and constant between 1976 and about 2012. And then you transition from millennials to Gen Z, and it starts to go down, and it has kept going down. So millennials said they wanted to have kids when they were 18, and then fewer of them did. Gen Z isn't even saying they want to have kids when they're 18. So that suggests that birth rate's going to keep going down.
Right. So replacement level is 2.1. And what is the United States at now?
I think we're at 1.7.
So in a century from now, we're going to see massive effects of that, I would imagine.
Very well. It very well could be. Yeah. And like Japan is already seeing this, that they already have that kind of demographic time bomb where there's so many more older people, and then there's not enough younger people to be the ones working to, say, pay into, say, Social Security and other programs like that, and to take care of the older people.
Right. Not to mention, in terms of how economies grow, you kind of need a constant new population of consumers, young consumers, coming up to buy your stuff and to innovate and whatever drives economies.
Yeah, so I think that change in the birth rate is going to have very big long-term effects.
Right. So, again, you and I came of age, and the concern about overpopulation, we have to do something about it. It's terrible. Going to be apocalyptic. Well, be careful what you wish for, because that's not what we got.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, because one of the predictors of population growth is women being economically empowered and having control over their reproductive choices. That's all you got to do, really, to get control of population, say, in these African countries. But it's hard to do that when you can't have much influence on there. Okay. All right. So let's just kind of wrap up here and talk about. I wanted to ask you about cultures of honor versus cultures of victimhood. You talk about that. I like that theory. I think it explains a lot. But how does that come online with generational differences?
Yeah, it's an interesting theory. Not mine. And the idea is we shifted away from a culture of honor where you kind of stand up for yourself when bad stuff happens, to the idea that you should go to outside authority figures. So that, many people have theorized, explains some of the changes on college campuses, where instead of having a conversation with someone who may say something you disagree with or that is even offensive, that you report it. So there's bias reporting teams and so on at some campuses. And that's a really fundamental shift. And I know, I can guess what a lot of Gen Z folks would say. They would say, well, why should the burden be on that person who has just, been insulted or offended? Why should they have to be the ones to argue that we should go to this authority figure? But I think the observation is just that this is very different than the previous model.
Right. Okay, and the shift in potential political party support in decades to come because of these generational changes?
I think it's going to be somewhat difficult to predict, because if that theory is correct, that your political leanings are dependent on the party and the popularity of the president when you were young. We've had two fairly unpopular presidents in a row now, Gen Z is going to be one to watch. They are voting at higher rates than young adults did when those young adults were millennials and Gen Xers. They anecdotally seem to be more politically engaged. And I think the potential danger comes from the fact that they're also a very pessimistic generation. There's a lot of negativity. And that's a time period thing too. It's not just Gen Z, it's kind of pretty pervasive. So if they can channel that into change within the system, that could be a very good outcome. But if instead their viewpoint is things are so bad we need to tear it all down and start over, I think then there's going to be a lot in older generations who will say, hold up, maybe we don't need to take it quite that far.
Right. Okay, a couple of other reckonings in the recent years. The Me Too movement. Is this a generational thing, like in the Trump trial, the rape trial that's going on now? Her explanation for why didn't you say something back in 90, whatever it was, my generation just didn't do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's some empirical support for that based on polling that a lot more boomers and silents will say, that's what we were told. Just don't talk about it and just put up with it. And in particular, a lot of millennial and Gen Z say, no, we're not going to put up with that anymore. And we're going to talk about that more openly. There's definitely a generational difference in that.
Yeah. Well, but, so if you look at the FBI statistics on rape and sexual assault, it looks like it's been going down, but then there's a spike up. The spike up is because it's happening more or because people are reporting it. They're freer to report it. There's more data collection about it. We focus on it. We care about it now more than previous generations did.
Yeah, and it's hard to say. I mean, and I've also had some trouble in recent years finding the statistics. I think they have changed the way they report them. And it also could be real and related to the increase in violent crime during the pandemic.
Yeah, because there was a spike in real crime. Yeah, but my sense is, race relations are good, but they're not always reported as being good. In terms of, again, looking across, say, the last 50 years or 100 years of how people think about, say, white Americans think about black Americans. Those surveys, would you move out if a black family moved into your neighborhood? How would you feel if one of your children married a black person? Those statistics have improved greatly.
Yes. Yeah, quite a bit. I mean, General Social Survey asked that question about, if a close relative married someone of another race, how would you feel? And just a huge radical change in that, much more acceptance. But what's changed, around 2015 in particular, is a lot of things around race just became much more politically polarized. And a lot more Americans started to say that they had concerns around race relations, that they felt race relations were getting worse after that point.
Well, that I would attribute to social media and the availability of all those videos. I mean, we just on an endless loop all day long, you can watch these horrible police killings and so forth. Not that there's more, because there aren't more police killings of blacks, but it's more, we're all more aware of it.
Yeah, they're much more visible. And, again, trade-offs, because I think a lot of people have observed that these videos make white America realize the reality of the situation, yet the constant exposure, it could end up being the availability heuristic, and kind of classic idea in social psychology that, that happens a lot with media, is you see these things happen and you think that they're very, very common. And absolutely they happen way too much, but saying that they're common is a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah. Well, and it's like the spike in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracy, and pretty much every university has this now, and corporations are incorporating it. It's not clear to me that there's a real problem to be solved, because things are better. So what is it these people are doing? I mean, ferreting out the last little tiny bit of racism that's left on. College campuses are the most liberal, tolerant, open, just bucolic, wonderful places on the planet to be. What's the problem? And one sense I have is that because we've all seen these horrible videos and the incidents and so on, and we all want to do something. I want to do something about it. What can I do? Okay, I'm not the governor of the state. I'm not the chief of police. What can I do? well, I'm a professor at the university, or I'm a dean, and I can hire somebody, and we're showing that, we are on top of this. We're not going to let this happen here.
Yeah, I think that's a good amount of it. I think the thing that's unfortunate is we haven't publicized enough some of the really solid research in social psychology that does show what actually does work to reduce prejudice and discrimination on college campuses. So one of my favorite social psychology studies of all time, done recently, says, hey, you take a group of students and you tell them more or less the truth. This is a campus that is very accepting and tolerant of people regardless of background. Most people on the campus want everyone to feel welcome. And you do that, that's actually something that leads to better relations between races, which is exactly the opposite of what many messages out there do. Is they'll say, no, it's racism is worse than ever, and it's everywhere, and we're going to have the bias reporting system. That ends up being more divisive and tends to backfire.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the last thing I want to even think about is the color of your skin. I don't care. I shouldn't want to care. And quit telling me I'm supposed to pay attention to that. This is my feeling as a boomer, I guess. It's like, what was the whole point of the civil rights movement? Things were terrible back in the 50s and before, and we did something about it. Okay, so, all right, maybe this is too recent to have definitive opinions on, but the trans movement, all of a sudden there's this massive spike, thousands of percent increase in identification as trans. What is that? Now, on the one side, it's a social contagion. The other side, they were always there. Now they're free to come out. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, what I really wanted to do in the book was dial into finding the actual data on this. That was my first goal, even if we don't know the why question. What are the real changes? Because I kept seeing the statistic of trans people are about 0.5%, 1 out of 200 people. I saw that over and over. And then there are some places that hasn't really changed. Well, it has, and it's changed particularly for young adults. So in one of the CDC administered surveys, starting in 2014, they had a question about, do you identify as male or female, or as transgender? And the identification as transgender among young adults went from that number, about 0.5%, to almost 2.5%. So quadrupling or more over a pretty short period, 7 years. 2014 to 2021 is the latest data we have from that survey. So, and the other interesting thing is it didn't change at all for those ages about 30 and over. Basically no change. So that's interesting, because if it was just acceptance, you'd think it would go up across all ages. But you could say, well, young adults, maybe with more acceptance, they have more freedom to explore that identity. They have more freedom to come out as trans. Maybe older people don't have that ability to blow up their lives and be trans. If they're, were already older when the era of greater acceptance happened. But this is very recent. I think we'd need a lot more research and understanding, around these trends and why they occurred. Because we really don't know right now, I think.
All right. That's probably a good place to wrap it up here, Gene. I loved your book. It's so data-driven. It's so great. What are you working on next? What's your next research projects?
Yeah. I did so much data analysis for this book. I think I could publish journal articles on it for quite a long time. So
right.
that might be the next step.
Yeah. Oh, and so what's the estimated polar generation ending? 2029? Did you say something like that?
Yeah, and that's a guess.
Yeah,
that's a guess. So I'm pretty confident of that cutoff of 2012 being the last year of Gen Z and 2013 being the first year of polars. But where polars will end, I think we have to see what happens.
Right. There's just no way to predict it, right? Because these changes are slow enough and long enough that more than 5 years out, no one has any idea what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Gene, here's the book again, everybody. Generations, it's called. Subtitle, The Real Differences Between Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, and Silence. and what they mean for America's future. If you want a good data-driven book, it's a good listen. I enjoyed the audio edition. But
yeah, be sure to say it's also fun.
Oh, it's totally. Oh my God, it's totally fun.
Yeah.
I forgot to, mention all the celebrities and writers and politicians for each generation and names. I found out my name, Michael, was so common when my mom named me, and mom and dad in 1954. I guess okay, so I'm not special. Darn.
That's okay. Most of us aren't special.
That's right. You think you are, and then you find out something else.
Right.
Yeah, no, that was all that, and the trend, the stuff you talk about, music and fashion and all that, how those things change. Again, you just don't quite see it until it's over. Like oh, that music. Is there anything to the stuff about at a certain almost an imprinting age, like the music you listen to between 15 and 25, you kind of imprint on that. That's the best music. And is there something to that?
I think so. I think that has even been somewhat, at least empirically proven, that your musical taste does, for most people anyway, tend to set during adolescence.
Yeah, I wonder why that is. Again, maybe a neurological thing or something, or neural pathways laid down for, in my case, classic rock. I just love classic rock. I appreciate grunge from the 90s and Madonna and Michael Jackson in the 80s. I love that music, but it just doesn't touch my soul like classic rock does. And it's really, it's just stamped in there.
Yep. And so as a Gen Xer, for me, it's 80s pop.
80s pop. Yes. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, it's great music. Right. Exactly. All right, Gene, thanks so much. Good place to end. Thanks for coming on and talking to me and for your patience.
All right. Thank you.